Hey, welcome back to Amateur Hour, where we learn how to make drum and bass with the freest, cheapest, and bestest plugins we can find whenever possible. Today, we are staying true to concept and using only free plugins, and we're going to make kick drums using the 100% free to use Vital synth. So to start out, that's span. If you don't know how to use span and make your settings right, here they are. I've given a full explanation in the last video, but this is the settings for that. Make sure you keep that somewhere where you can see it. And just as proof of concept, we are using the free limiter Loud Max. I'm going to be honest, it's not as good for what we're doing today as Pro L, so I would highly recommend spending your money to get that, but this will do just fine for what we're doing. To get the most out of this, I did have to turn up the sound in Vital quite a lot. So with that being said, this is Vital. As you can see, I have it set up to resemble Serum because this is essentially the poor man's Serum. It can do just about everything Serum can do. This is my kick synthesizing preset. Just to start off, we went over in the last video what a kick drum is, but to reiterate, it's a sine wave pitched down at a rapid rate. That's the pure sine wave. We also have a noise layer, just like in Kick 2, we have, where the difference is we have 3 noise oscillators and 1 sub oscillator. It's the reversed here, but you only really need 1 noise oscillator, as you can see here. And this will create our transit. Let's reinitialize this and show you how to make it. If you don't want to sit through all of this, you can skip ahead in the video and you can download the preset yourself. I'm going to upload it to Google Drive. We're going to start off with, of course, a basic shapes. It's got all these options. We only need one. This one right here. What we don't want is note tracking. So that scale I just played, we can't play it anymore. Every key plays the same note. That's what we want. We're going to bring this down to -24, which is 2 octaves. You can also hold shift. You can use the scroll wheel or click and drag. That is our sub bass right there. As you can see, it's playing a C1. And 32 hertz is quite low. The kick is not going to sit at any one note and certainly not at 30 hertz. But in order to get the sweep, we need to do a couple things. Even though this is called the envelope right here in the synth, Vital and Serum have one thing in common, which is that the envelope is not as customizable per se as the LFO, or as versatile, I should say. So we are using the LFO in envelope mode. If I stick this on the pitch, you can watch that side sweep in beautiful slow motion. Of course, we don't want slow motion, so we can set this to 1/8. We've basically made a laser there. We want a little bit more precision than that, so we're going to switch this to seconds. Now it's starting out way too high in pitch, so we're going to change this right here. The number on, let's call this the amount of modulation that the LFO is doing, starts out at a multiple of 12, and 12 is the number of semitones in an octave. 72 means 6 octaves. That's way too many octaves. So we're going to bring this down to 48, which is 4 octaves. Next, we want to change the envelope to look more like Kick 2. And really get that rapid sine sweep. Now we're getting somewhere. So if we look at this number here as our starting point, it's 48, which is 48 semitones or 4 octaves above our end point, which is this one right here. So we're essentially starting that sine sweep at, it'd be C5, and it's coming down to C1. And that sweep happens so rapidly, you can barely see it on the span, but it is there. So if we think of this as our top point, this starting point right here on the LFO is literally the same as that starting point. We can even set a grid here to have it snap. I wouldn't recommend doing that just because it's not really that necessary, especially for making drum and bass kicks. So we're actually going to get rid of the grid entirely so we can see better and don't have that snapping. So we've been using the key for this the whole time. The problem with that is we don't get the advantage of the custom envelope that we set in here, which is where we're going to really determine what the sound is like. We still want this pitch sweep to be pretty close to the amount of time we actually want, but let's hear what this sounds like when we play it with the automation. So, oh, you want to turn smooth off, by the way. So you want to literally play this by ear. You need to experiment and tweak these settings and see what they sound like, because there's not going to be one single answer to, like, numbers wise in this synth to getting it to sound the way you want. But this is the gist of the pitch sweep right here. This envelope right here, it's going to look something like that. Or you can mess around and do something crazy different. You know, I'm not your boss. So next, we need to give this a little more power. It's not got quite the oomph that Kick 2 had. So we're going to make a few extra tweaks here. We do have a final EQ here. That's going to be after all of these effects that we do here. And that's going to be our final boost to get it sounding exactly how we want. But before that, we want to set this EQ up. We're going to be using other samples in this video, so we can cut off some of the low end here. I'm going to go ahead and set this manually to about 80 hertz, and I'm also going to set a bit of an increase here at the same frequency. And then I'm going to tweak that while we let it play. We want to give this boost, even though we have a cutoff right next to it. We want to give this little boost here because we still want around 60 to 80 hertz to get boosted. And the final outcome of the sound is going to also need that boost. But we still have a few things to do to get quite to the power level that we had with Kick 2. So next thing in the chain is a compressor in single band mode. And we're basically just going to mess with this top thing here, and we're going to turn this into an expander. You can mess around with this down here. It doesn't really seem to do very much for this purpose, but it's there. We also want the release and attack to be a little bit lower. I think this makes them faster in both cases. So you're starting to hear it sounds a lot like a real kick drum, but we're not there yet. Next, we need to add some distortion. And we're not going to do what we did with Free Clip and have a hard clip on this, because the hard clip is a very hard clip on here. But we do want to cut out some of this in post. So we're going to set this. We just don't want to distort too much of the high end in this sample. So let's hear that with and without the filter. So it's a little hard to get everything in view for you, but you get the idea. So we're just going to use my example from the preset, but you've seen how to set it up. We've got those same effects all in here. We actually didn't use the filter on the distortion. So we're going to go ahead and render that out. So even though this had a pretty nice transient on it, we're using this as a body layer. And the reason for that is that we're going to use samples to give us a much better transient. So there is some EQ already on it, but we're gonna see if we could squeeze a little more sound out of it. You will not be able to hear the preview because it does not go to the master, but I'm going to select another kick with a transient that I like, and we're going to marry the two together. I've used this one before. It's a great effect. Don't need anything past this point in the automation. Where is my fade out? Hang on a second. Okay, I'm an idiot, and you're about to see why this is called amateur hour. You cannot set the fade on your samples with the automation showing. So we're learning every day, folks. So instead of using automation for this, we're going to use the sample. That's my preferred method when we're dealing with samples. There's no reason to use gain automation unless you're using MIDI, because you get way more control over the MIDI with that automation, but you get way more control over the samples without it when you're dealing with audio, which is why I prefer to use audio in general. Oh, the gain went to 0 because I deleted the envelope. So we're going to have a nice tight transient. I really like the sound of this one. It's a closed hi-hat, and you can really hear it ringing. Let's hear it one more time. So that's adding a lot of nice frequencies that we very much like to mess with there. So we're going to go ahead and render this. Before we do that, though, we're going to save the transient as well on its own. Even though we didn't synthesize this, I'm likely to use it again. So for my own purposes, I'm saving this transient on its own, because the rest of the kick is fine as well. There's no problem with using samples wholesale. You can use a sample by itself if you want. The reason we're doing this and using samples to do it is it doesn't cost anything extra to use the samples. If you have them, use them. But we want to get the most out of our sound and make them the most unique, which is why we layer our samples together. So that's V2. So that's a very nice, I want to say messy. It looks messy, this waveform, and we want that in the transient on these kicks because it's what gives it that flavor and character. We're just going to clear that. Let's just add a buffer zone of audio here. So that's a very nice kick so far. We want to add to it with the noise layer, and we're going to use Vital again to do that. And I'm going to show you a little more in depth with the noise oscillator. We got to make sure we're sitting in the automation where the gain is at maximum. Oh, and when you're using MIDI controller directly, you have to make sure this is set to in or auto. If it's set to off, it just won't use your MIDI. It'll use the MIDI information from here, but not from your keyboard. So noise oscillator is essentially just a sampler in Vital. We're not going to have it playing for nearly that long, so something like that is cool, but not very helpful for us. Let's hear these with the limited bit of envelope that we're using. We're going to give it a little bit extra right there. That's pretty good. But we're going to do something that I actually meant to do in the last video, but we're going to show you today. This is another free plugin from Voxengo. And what this does is takes the sound and moves it on the timeline, forward and backward, left and right. But it does it at the micro level. So in this case, it's in milliseconds. I'm not sure what meter and foot are supposed to do. I've never used those, but you can adjust by up to 9 of any of these increments. 1,000, 110, 1.1.01 in milliseconds. So you can go up to 9 seconds of delay. So if you want, when I stopped playing it, it took that long for the sound to come through. So the reason we want to do that is because when we have two sounds playing at the same time, their waves can cancel each other out. If you have two waves that are identical in volume and pitch and they're happening at the exact same time, you essentially get silence. We don't want that. We definitely don't want that. We want the full sound as much as possible. And so we're essentially trying to just ever so slightly move these waves so that they fill in the gaps between each other. And these are not going to be perfect waves, obviously, but because they're imperfect, they're going to give a little bit weird, wonky cancellations. And we want to maximize our quality and potential volume by tweaking this. So we're going to hear these two sounds together and see what we get. Now the noise is a little too simplistic, so it might not be getting much of an effect out of this, but what we can do is marry this with another sample. So we're going to turn this off for now. We're going to move this down here. We don't want any of the transient interfering, which is the reason we have this ramp up here. So we're going to match this up to there. So we're going to put these together. And every time I make one of these videos or decide to sit down and have a drum making session, I'm saving all of these little parts to use. I have so much at my disposal now just from doing that, on top of, thousands of drum samples that I've downloaded. So now we've got basically a custom noise layer. We've got essentially a drum a sine wave that we've added noise to make it super spiky and chaotic. And that's what we're going for. So when we put these two together with the sound delay, we're going to fade it in a little bit. I'm not sure where that noise is coming from still. Oh, it is that. Okay. So before we do the sound delay, we're going to make sure that we get the sound as quiet as we want it, because it's obviously doing a little too much here. All right, that sounds pretty good. Now let's see what happens when we tweak it with the sound delay. Still getting a little bit of clicking at the end of that. There we go. So you can hear a little bit of difference there, and it just kind of, in fact, it might be easier to see it on the span. It's kind of pushing a little bit louder. And it's also giving us a little bit of extra sound, and I believe that's just because the fade out point is later. We can bring it in a little bit. And that's what we got going with that. We're going to render out once again. We're going to make sure we include the whole sample in the render. Even though we're going to be rendering silence at the point where it's faded out, we want to keep clips at a certain length, and there's reasons for that. Trust me, bro. So we've got a new render. That should be a different color. Now, in the last video, I showed how to do a frequency split technique. We're going to do the same thing. So I'm not going to go over how to make it again, and I'm going to use, well, as proof of concept, I am going to use the free version that we used. This adds a lot more latency. As you can see at the bottom of the screen there, it adds 278.5 milliseconds of latency. So that's 0.2 seconds. That's quite noticeable. It's enough that it will throw it off when we try to select the timeline to master or to render. So, keep that in mind. But we're going to go ahead and use the free clip here. I went over this before, but just in short, this splits the high and low frequencies within this group of effects, so that one effect chain has nothing put on the high end and the other effect chain has free clip distortion plugin on the low end. And what this does is just gives us a nice boost. We're going to turn these squigglies into boxes. So we've added quite a bit of distortion there. And now we're just going to render this out again. And I'm going to guesstimate that we need to render everything up to here because of the latency. It wasn't actually that bad. In fact, it didn't appear to do anything, but we know it did. Make sure you remove the whole group when you're done with it, or the latency will still be there even if you turn it off. We want to get a little bit more volume out of this section here. So we're going to just boost the gain a tiny bit right there. And by a tiny bit, I mean a lot. Oh, and I made a mistake. We want we want the gain at 0 because we don't want to affect it except for this little section here. We want a lot of curve, but we don't want it to curve that high. So let's actually call this about 420. Why not? Blaze it. So it seems a little counterintuitive, but the more gain we add to this, the quieter the result becomes because of the limiter. And that's because we're using the free limiter. Free plugins are great, but there is a reason that the people pay a lot for the big ones. Just keep that in mind. So we might get a little bit more out of this. So go ahead and render that. This will be our final render for the day. So we did get a little bit of extra volume in there. You kind of get the idea. We don't need to drive ourselves insane trying to add more and more and more volume when we have music to make. You really don't want to get yourself bogged down too much in this process if it means that you're not creating your art. Like I've said before, there's no problem using samples. No one's going to judge you for it. Well, people are going to judge you for it, but who cares? It's your music. Make your music. Do your art. Anyway, here's our final product. So we went from this purely synthetic, very cold, unfeeling kick to this. Now, we did use a lot of samples to create this. Well, we used 3, but this is ours. And you can make one just like it, not quite just like it. And that's the point here. So I hope you learned something, hope you had fun, and hope I see you in the next video where we're going to cover snare drums.